For 6 straight years, that young nurse brought food to a homeless man no one else even looked at. But on her wedding day, 12 U.S. Marines in full dress uniform showed up unexpectedly. No one could have guessed they were there because of that very homeless man, and when his true identity was revealed, all of America stood still. Boston winters cut through the skin. Snow drifted lightly onto rooftops, then settled into a thin layer on the benches lining Charlesgate Park. That's where Grace Turner, 29, had started every morning for the past 6 years. Not for the view, but for a person. The old homeless man sitting there looked nearly the same each day. A faded army coat, a knit hat pulled low over his ears, deep-set eyes behind a silver beard. Grace didn't know his real name. She called him something she came up with herself, Mac, a name that sounded strong yet quietly sad. They never had long conversations. She'd leave a hot lunchbox on the bench, grilled chicken sandwich, sometimes her mom's butternut squash soup, along with a little slip of paper bearing a quote like, "Today is a good day to start over." Mac always nodded in thanks, some days offering a faint smile. But he never asked for anything more. Grace was a nurse, and her hospital shifts left her exhausted, but not once did she skip her stop at the park. Her coworkers said she was naive, that helping the homeless was like tossing salt into the ocean. But Grace saw it differently. If one meal can make someone feel seen, how could that ever be a waste? One time, she stayed a little longer than usual, her hands freezing around a cup of coffee. "Mac," she said softly, "do you have any family?" He didn't answer. He just stared quietly toward the old oak tree in the distance, as if the memories there were too heavy to bring back into the present. Grace didn't press. She knew some people carry pain so deep that silence is the only way they survive, and if the meals she brought helped him make it through one more day, then that was enough. That morning was like every other, but Grace had no idea that just a few weeks later that bench would sit empty, and the quiet kindness she had sown would bloom in a way no one ever expected. 6:30 a.m. The wind was sharper than usual, but Grace still carried a box of apple pastries and a cup of black coffee, Mac's favorite, no sugar, no cream. She walked the cobblestone path, her shoes sinking into soft snow, and stopped in her tracks. The bench was empty. There was no sign of him. No worn knit hat, no cart tracks, not even fresh footprints in the snow. Just a blank stretch of white. Grace stood there for a few minutes, a little unsure. Maybe he just slept in? Or moved to another shelter. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't know where to leave the food. The next day, the bench was still empty. And the third day, too. On the fourth day, Grace brought a wool blanket and laid it on the bench, along with a small note. "I don't know where you've gone, but I still remember." She sat there for a long time until her hands went numb. That evening, when Grace returned to her small apartment near the Longfellow Bridge, there was a thick yellow envelope in her mailbox. No return address. Just one word printed in bold letters on the front. Grace. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, the paper old, the ink slightly smudged, as if it had been waiting a long time to be read. "Grace, I'm not good at writing letters. My eyes aren't what they used to be. But I need to say this, before it's too late. I was once a gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps. I lost everything when I came home. My wife, my house, my honor. I wandered, lost, and nearly gave up on the goodness in this world. Then you came along. No questions, no judgment, just breakfast. But it reminded me I was still human. You saved me, not with a bandage or a needle, but by giving me a reason to want one more day. I've left Boston. An old friend helped me find a place to stay, and I'm trying to find myself again. I leave you this promise. If the day ever comes when you need help, no matter what, I'll be there." Mac Grace sat still, tears falling before she realized. All these years, she had never expected anything in return. But now, everything she'd done in silence rang loud and clear, like the universe had just wrapped her in a hug. She didn't know where Mac would end up. But she knew one thing for certain. This chapter wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. For 3 weeks after Mac disappeared, Grace couldn't stop thinking about that short letter. "I never told you who I really am, but one day, you'll know." Those words lingered in her mind, even as she changed dressings or checked blood pressure during her shifts. He hadn't just been a wandering homeless man like she had thought. But if that was true, then who was he? One evening, during her break, Grace went online and typed in a phrase she once thought meaningless, a name he'd murmured in his sleep, White Lion. He'd whispered it once when she was tucking a blanket over him during a winter night. At the time, she assumed it was a tangled memory, but now she wasn't so sure. She hadn't expected that one phrase to unlock a string of old news articles. White Lion, the legendary commander of the U.S. Marine Corps, vanished after final mission in Afghanistan. Hero or ghost, only 6 survived the siege of Kandahar, all under White Lion's command. Grace read every line, every detail, and started to recognize familiar pieces. The commander's name was Malcolm S. Whitaker, but his men called him White Lion because of his prematurely silver hair and the kind of fearless bravery that bordered on madness in hopeless battles. There was a black and white photo in the article. Though it was faded and taken over a decade ago, Grace knew instantly. That was Mac. She was stunned. For 6 years, she had shared meals with a man considered a living legend, and never had a clue. And he, somehow, had chosen to live in complete anonymity on a park bench, avoiding both glory and grief. Why? She began digging deeper, reaching out to veterans through a private forum, one where soldiers who had once served under White Lion might still be lurking in silence. And just as her instincts told her, a user named Ghost7 replied with a single line, "If you're Grace, the one who fed him for 6 years, then on your wedding day, we'll repay that debt for him." Grace read the message over and over. A chill ran down her spine. Only then did she begin to realize her big day was about to be something far beyond ordinary. And Mac, or rather Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Whitaker, maybe he never truly left. Maybe he was just preparing his final gift. Grace never imagined she'd get engaged like this. Jake, her boyfriend, a gentle, steady civil engineer, had gone down on one knee on an ordinary evening at home, with candlelight flickering off an untouched slice of toast. No soft music, no fancy restaurant, just 2 people who understood each other, loved each other, and knew that was enough. Grace said yes, of course, but in her heart there was still an unspoken space not yet filled. Mac, or rather Malcolm Whitaker. The man she once thought was broken and forgotten, now revealed to be someone who existed far outside any ordinary frame. 3 weeks later, as Grace began planning her wedding, strange things started happening. First came a bouquet of white roses delivered to her workplace. No sender's name, just a small handwritten card. "Wishing you joy, my Florence." Florence. That was what Mac used to call her, half joking that she was his modern-day Florence Nightingale, an angel in scrubs. But how could he know when her wedding day was? Unless... The following week, one of Jake's coworkers approached Grace quietly and asked, "Do you have family in the military?" Yesterday, a man in uniform showed up at the site looking for Jake. He didn't say much, just shook his hand and said, "Thank you for loving her right." Grace was too stunned to speak. Then, on a Saturday morning while trying on wedding dresses at a small boutique outside town, the shop owner said, "Someone paid for your entire dress." A silver-haired man in a worn coat. He said, "Grace deserves to wear the best on her day." Grace nearly broke down in tears right then and there. She felt like she was being watched, but not in a frightening way, more like protected. Like a father silently standing beyond the fence, watching his daughter step into her new life. She no longer had any doubt. Mac was still around. Maybe he wasn't strong enough to attend the wedding in person, but he was quietly leaving his mark. That night, she reopened the old letter, staring at Mac's shaky handwriting. "You'll know. When the time comes, you'll know." And Grace began to believe that time was drawing near. But she could never have imagined what would happen on her wedding day, when 12 men in uniform stood solemnly in the aisle. Not as guests, but to fulfill a promise that had been waiting for more than a decade. On the morning of the wedding, the small church in the quiet town felt unusually solemn, unlike any ordinary day. Grace's family and friends had all gathered, their whispers and laughter filling the space. But inside, she still carried a quiet, unshakable anticipation. Grace stood in the back room, hands clutching her wedding dress, gazing out the window. The sky was a clear blue, and sunlight filtered gently through the trees, casting shimmering patches of light on the churchyard. Her thoughts drifted to Mac, the man who had become such a meaningful part of her life, even though they'd never truly been close. As the opening music played, she stepped out, her heart pounding, eyes searching for Jake, the man she would spend the rest of her life with. Everything seemed to pass in a blur. The walk down the aisle, the sacred vows, the joyful smiles on everyone's faces. But the moment that brought the entire church to breathless silence came when the large doors at the back creaked open. A line of men stepped in. Not regular guests, but 12 men in full military dress, standing tall and still like living statues. Every head turned. The shock on each face was unmistakable. Grace stood frozen. Jake stared, speechless. The commander, a middle-aged man with warm eyes, stepped forward to the altar. "We are Malcolm Whitaker's comrades. Max," he said, his voice deep but commanding. "We are here to honor our friend, our teammate, and to thank Grace, who gave him something we thought he'd lost: love and care." No one had expected that Mac, once forgotten by society, had become an honored soldier with lifelong bonds among his brothers in arms. Another soldier stepped forward, handing Grace a small box. Inside was a medal, the medal for humanity and courage. Tears ran down Grace's cheeks as she felt the warmth and recognition she had never dreamed of before. "He always spoke of you," the commander continued. "Mac couldn't be here today, but he prepared everything through the letters and small gifts you received. We stand here in his place to say thank you and give our blessings." The church erupted in applause and congratulations. Grace felt her heart overflow, not just with Jake's love, but with the deep acknowledgement from strangers who knew her and Mac's story well. The wedding day became not only a new beginning for Grace and Jake, but also a heartfelt tribute to a man once forgotten. Grace understood that love and kindness can change destiny, and that genuine bonds will always find a way to endure, no matter how many years pass. After the wedding, before Grace and Jake could leave the church, the middle-aged soldier, the one who had represented the group of 12, approached them once again. In his hands was an old envelope, sealed with red wax. He handed it to Grace with both hands, his eyes serious but full of emotion. "This is the last letter Mac wrote to you," he said softly. "He asked us to deliver it to you today. He said it should only be read once you are officially Grace Whitaker." Grace took the envelope, her hands trembling. She and Jake returned to the small sitting room inside the church, sat down on the familiar wooden bench, and she carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter on blue ink, the slanted handwriting a little shaky but still very neat. "To Grace, the girl who changed the rest of my life. By the time you read these words, I may no longer be sitting on the old bench behind the hospital. I have gone away, but please don't be sad. I go with a warm heart, warmed by mornings with toast and your gentle smile. I used to be a soldier, but after the war I lost everything: family, friends, faith. I wandered for years, never finding a place to call my own, until you came along. You never asked who I was, nor did you ever refuse me a meal, even though you knew I had nothing to give back. But in truth, you gave me more than anyone ever did, a reason to keep living. You once asked me why I sat there every day. I said it was out of habit. The truth is, I just wanted to see you doing well, even if only from afar. I know the wedding day is an important milestone, but I also know a man like me would only make things awkward. So I chose to stay in your memories, gentle, unobtrusive, never interfering with your joy. You may think I had nothing, but somewhere I still have a family, and like you, from now on, you are my family. That's why I left this." Grace paused. Inside the envelope was a small brass key, along with a tiny note. "Safe Deposit Box 314, Riverbank Bank." Jake frowned. "He had a safe deposit box?" Grace nodded, feeling confused. They looked at each other, a strange feeling stirring inside, as if everything they knew about Mac was just the tip of a submerged iceberg. Outside, the 12 soldiers had quietly left, leaving no names behind, but they had opened a new door for Grace, a part of Mac's life she had never known. She clutched the key tightly in her hand. "We have to go to the bank," she whispered. Jake nodded. They didn't know what awaited behind that metal door, but Grace's intuition told her it was the greatest secret Mac had left behind. Riverbank Bank was located in the town center, not far from the hospital where Grace used to work. The next morning, she and Jake arrived early, carrying Mac's brass key and the note with the box number, 3114. The bank employee, an older woman named Linda, froze the moment she saw the note and the key. She pressed her lips together, her eyes suddenly taking on an unusually serious look. He told me once that if a girl named Grace Whitaker ever came, I was to take her straight to the secure vault room. No further verification needed. Grace and Jake followed Linda into the vault area. It was a cold room with thick steel walls, so silent that even the sound of their own hearts beating was loud. Linda took a spare key and inserted it into the left lock. Grace used her key on the right. Both keys turned simultaneously. The small door clicked open with a dry clack. Inside was a heavy metal box about the size of a small suitcase. Linda nodded and quietly left the room, leaving the young couple alone with what was about to be revealed. Grace opened the lid. First was a neatly clipped bundle of documents addressed to Grace Whitaker. Beneath it was a thick stack of sealed envelopes, each bearing a name, and strangely, all of them were names Grace didn't recognize. Jake frowned, holding a sheet of paper from the first bundle of documents. It was a will. Grace began to read. The first line stunned her. I, Malcolm Whitaker, former Lieutenant Colonel of the United States Marine Corps, as the sole surviving member of Unit 42, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. She looked up, stammering, He was a lieutenant colonel? Jake nodded slowly. And it seems he was also the leader of a special operations team. Grace continued reading. In the will, Mac left his entire bank account balance, a number that left both of them speechless. $1.3 million. He wrote clearly, This money is what I have saved all my life, never spent because I had no purpose. But now I do. Grace, you are the reason I survived my final years. This money belongs to you. Use it to do something meaningful. Grace covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jake was silent, squeezing her hand. She bent down and opened one of the envelopes. Inside was a handwritten letter and an old military medal engraved with a soldier's name, presented to the wife of Lance Corporal David Holloway, killed in action in Afghanistan, 2008. She suddenly understood. These envelopes were memories, gifts Mac had kept safe for his comrades, waiting for the day he could pass them on to their families. He had lived like a ghost, but had kept faith, preserving the legacy of each fallen friend. Grace sank into the chair. He wasn't just the man I fed breakfast to, she whispered. He carried an entire generation on his shoulders. Jake wrapped an arm around her, his eyes red. No one said another word. In the cold vault room, they felt something deeply alive. Loyalty, sacrifice, and humanity from a man's society called homeless. 2 days later, Grace and Jake's small apartment was filled with stacks of files, sealed envelopes, and documents from the bank's safe deposit box. Each envelope bore a name, a story, a trace of a forgotten past, until today. Grace sat amid the piles of paperwork, a whiteboard and a cooling cup of tea in front of her. She opened each envelope one by one, reading letters, inspecting medals, old photos, then jotting down names, addresses if available, and status notes like needs verification, recipient deceased, or may be found through veterans. Jake stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Are you sure? This is going to be a long journey. It won't be easy. Grace looked up, her gaze calm but determined. I'm not doing this because Mac left money. I'm doing it because he kept these things for decades, because he believed someone would return these memories to the right people. Jake nodded. Then I'll be with you every step of the way. And they began. By contacting veteran organizations, searching military records, looking through public casualty lists, and even using social media, they followed the clues. One letter led them to the only daughter of Sergeant Hal Morris, now living in Texas. Another envelope held an unsent letter to Corporal Reese's wife in Montana. He had died in a battle in Fallujah. Grace sent the first letter quietly, then the second, then the third. Each time, she handwritten a small note at the bottom. I didn't know who he was until he left all this behind, but I do know this. He never forgot you. In the third week, an 8 a.m. call came. A middle-aged woman's trembling voice asked, Are you Grace, the one who sent Hal Morris's letter? I'm his daughter. Grace pressed her lips together, trying to keep her voice steady. Yes, that's me. I'm just doing what Mr. Mack wanted. Silence hung for a moment on the other end. Then she choked out, Thank you. My family never got anything back from my father after the war. My mother died without knowing he left any message. You don't know how much this means to us. Grace put down the phone, covering her face with both hands. Jake wrapped his arms around her from behind, letting her cry. I think he knew exactly what he was doing, Jake said. He didn't just leave money, he left responsibility, trust, and forgiveness. Grace nodded gently, her heart full of emotion. That day, she opened her laptop and created a new folder. At the top, she typed Operation Last Letter. She decided to make this journey public, not to tell her own story, but to tell theirs. The people forgotten by time and war, and about an old homeless man named Mac, who never forgot anyone at all. 1 week after Grace posted the first video recounting the Operation Last Letter journey, everything began to change in ways she never imagined. The video was less than 8 minutes long, just a short clip where she spoke softly, placing a faded yellow envelope next to an old black and white photo of a young soldier. Grace told the story of what Mr. Mack had left behind, what he had kept silent for decades. She didn't cry, but her eyes were enough to make strangers pause and listen. In just 3 days, the video reached over 2 million views. Viewers started leaving thousands of comments. Some shared that their grandfathers had gone missing in the war, others asked if Grace could help them find relics, and some simply left 2 words: thank you. A local TV station invited her for an interview. Then a veterans organization contacted her, offering help to trace the names on Mr. Mack's list. A high school student in Kentucky emailed volunteering to research old military records on weekends. Grace sat in her small apartment, staring at the screen flooded with messages and emails, her heart sinking. She whispered, "Mr. Mack, can you see? Your name is no longer unknown." Grace never intended to become a social media hero, but she couldn't ignore the hundreds of families reaching out, asking how to find relatives lost in the war. She received a message from an elderly woman in Nebraska. "I found my father's letter from the battlefield in 1943, thanks to your video. Thank you for giving me the courage to search." Grace decided to start a nonprofit called the Last Letter Project, a place where those who lost loved ones in war could send letters, search for information, or simply find someone to share with. Within 6 months, the project attracted thousands of volunteers from across the states. They were students, veterans, historians, teachers, homemakers, all united by one goal: to bring back names once thought forgotten, honoring and remembering them. And among all those names, Malcolm S. Whitaker's was given a special place: the originator. The man who lived as a homeless wanderer by the roadside, with no proper burial, leaving behind nothing but an old paper bag and the pride of having once worn a uniform. On the organization's first anniversary, Grace and Jake, now her husband, traveled to Washington, D.C. for a memorial ceremony. They laid a white wreath at the war memorial and read aloud the names the project had helped recover over the past year. In the soft wind rustling through the trees, in the quiet eyes of those attending, a sacred silence enveloped the moment. Grace looked up at the sky, her eyes slightly closed. "Do you see, Mr. Mack? You're no longer unknown." A hand gently rested on her shoulder. It was one of the 12 Marines from the wedding, the man who once bowed before Mr. Mack's photo. "We still tell his story to the new recruits," he said, not because he was a hero on the battlefield, but because he lived like a soldier until his very last breath, and because someone never abandoned him. Grace said nothing. She simply nodded, tears welling up, but a smile still on her lips. As they walked away, a young black girl about 8 years old ran up, holding a letter. "Miss Grace, I wrote a letter to my great-grandpa too. Do you think he'll be able to read it?" Grace knelt down and gently rubbed the girl's head. "I believe he will, and if you write it with all your heart, he will surely hear you." War can take many things away, but kindness, starting from a simple meal on a street corner, created a legacy far greater than any Medal of Honor. And in that moment, across a vast country, a man once called unknown became an eternal part of America's heart.